I guess start with what each book is about, and then from there, uh, go into like the Kickstarter and stuff, or
Sure, yeah, by all means, please, you first.
oh, okay. Oh, well, that's, like, stressful now.
Do you want me to go first? I'll go
Yeah,
first.
yeah, you go first.
Okay. Hi, internet. My name is Trevor. I write, edit, and art direct a sci-fi thriller comic book called Area 51: The Helix Project. It is currently on Kickstarter for its finale, its sixth and final issue, but don't fret, you can catch up and grab everything in order to read the entire story. It's effectively about a half extraterrestrial boy named Kent, very deliberately so. Yes, you can homage Big Blue. So he's sort of what's the word I'm looking for? You would think, yeah, I pitched this book so many times, and I still get these little moments where I'm like, oh yeah, what did I write a book about?
I always
Um,
do that too.
it's so bad. But effectively, he's a half-breed extraterrestrial whose father was like the original was the sort of inciting incident behind the mass Roswell sightings in the US in the late 40s. And it sort of presupposes that his father had masqueraded for humans for a few decades until he is eventually murdered after exposing his alien physiology in a last ditch attempt to save a young girl's life. In doing so, he kind of the boy Kent is sort of tortured by the loss and spends the next 13 years of his life trying to pick up the pieces until a mysterious figure confronts him and sort of flips his life upside down by putting into question the death of his father. And as he's driven to uncover the circumstances surrounding what this is becoming a so-called death, he ends up getting dropped into the jaw of this massive Cold War genetics conspiracy and is ultimately forced to face a twisted ghost from his past that challenges everything he knows about himself and what it means to be human. So, really personal story. And what's really cool is like all the sci-fi stems from like hard science. My academic background in school was in molecular and cellular biology, so I get to sprinkle some of that in there and not feel like I wasted tens of thousands of dollars.
Oh,
Uh,
cool.
so
That makes
yeah,
it even better.
yeah. So there's like, it's I think it's pretty emotionally authentic. It's relevant. Like, it just plays with themes of identity and memory and loss. But like has that scientific authenticity as well. But yeah, so that's the book. It's on Kickstarter. And I hope you guys check it out. Otherwise though, Mary, like talk to the people about your awesome project. It looks fantastic.
And for anyone who wants to pick up, copies or support the Kickstarter, in the description, we put the links for both comics, so, yeah, check them out.
Yeah,
I'm super excited to read the Helix Project. It sounds sweet. Um,
thanks.
so mine is, a kind of like post-apocalyptic dark fantasy comic, kind of essentially about a world where, an apocalyptic event that will be revealed later occurred that basically like reverted the world back to a fantasy kind of medieval vibe. There's a lot of monsters and magic, and basically it's about two main protagonists who are going through this world and facing the ghosts of their past, mysteries from their past, and their paths and their journeys diverge towards either darkness or light, and they both kind of develop into either a hero or a villain.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's super rad because like based on like everything you had sent me, like you have a pretty long story to tell with these characters and this world, right?
Yeah, it's gonna be really long. I think in my head I have the general idea for like a few story arcs, and then I have all the plot outlines done for the first arc, which is gonna be 10 issues, hopefully.
Wow.
So
Wow.
it's gonna be pretty long, so I'm kind of excited to get it going finally.
Yeah, that's super cool. How do you like now that you've kind of gotten to the point where you're writing and drawing? I'm curious, like, were there any challenges that you faced, like taking that leap to writing your own original content that you didn't really expect going into it?
I think it was weird because I've always kind of like preferred writing, or at least writing has always been like bigger, more of a passion for me than the drawing aspect of it. And I've always just kind of like used drawing to get the story on paper kind of thing. Um,
Wow.
so it was nice kind of jumping back into it, but just because I guess one challenge was, since it's such a long story, kind
Mm.
of making sure all the events line up in the right way, and also like splitting it into issues because I've written kind of more book, like I wrote a book a while ago, so I'm used to that format more. So splitting it up into issues and having to learn like the format for an outlining each issues and story arcs was a little bit challenging, but also really
Mm.
cool to kind of learn about that.
Yeah, that's really, really interesting to hear because I feel like, I mean, I found you because of your artwork, right? Like, I mean, for anybody, like, I actually reached out to Mary first because I've been keeping up with her work like way, like since I first started making comics, which is not a long time ago, 2 years-ish. But I was like, wow, like she's incredibly talented. I wanted to keep up with your work. And once you like launched the Kickstarter, I was like, it's just really weird thinking that like your base kind of started with wanting to write, but you feel like your notoriety has come from your awesome artwork.
Yeah, it's weird. I guess I kind of like always wrote stuff and then just never really thought I could do anything with it. And then just recently, and see, of course, seeing all the other like independent creators and stuff on, like, I find Twitter so good for that. Just getting in touch
Mm.
with other creators and it's like, hey, wait, like this is actually possible. You can do it. So
Yeah, yeah,
yeah.
100%. It's
Speaking
it's
of, speaking of which, I was gonna say, yeah, when did you start doing all this? Like you mentioned, you had like six or so campaigns you've done before this one.
yeah, so this is the sixth. This is for the sixth issue in the series. I it's weird. In college, I started a YouTube channel to like review and talk about comics. um, because none of my friends like comics, and I really wanted to talk to somebody about it. And I the further I got, the more I kind of like started teaching myself about the technical elements of making comics because I felt like there was a lot of that missing in the review space where people were just like giving like kind of baseless opinion content as opposed to like let's talk about the craft, like what's going on here, how are we breaking down like the success of the art versus the writing, the coloring, the lettering, so on and so forth. And I did a lot of that and got to interview a lot of really talented people. And then eventually in October of 2019 I attended a press panel for Marvel, and I had asked a question to CB Cebulski and Chris Claremont about like finding or reconciling the need to, or the sort of pure desire to tell something like that's yours and that's like emotionally resonant and have like your artistic expression, but also like having to accommodate like the larger corporate interests that are trying to sell product, which could have gone either way, right? Like they could have been like, oh, this asshole, like but CB ended up like approaching me after, and we talked for a little bit, and he handed me his business card. He's like, have you ever thought about working in comics? And at the time I was still in school for molecular biology, and I was like, I have never seriously considered that until you asked me that question right now. um, so I applied for an editorial internship, and I went for my interview in March of 2020. And I was in New York like the week that hand sanitizer and toilet paper was selling out
Oh
everywhere.
my gosh.
Yeah, weird time. Like I just go back to that moment in time and I'm like, this isn't gonna stick, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna be back in New York working for Marvel in a couple weeks, right? Um, that didn't happen. And so lockdown kind of kept prolonging the whole thing. And eventually I was just like, I don't want to ask for permission to do what I want to do anymore. I want to create. I want to get these things out there. And so by the end ish of 2020, I started working on the beginning of Area 51, the Helix Project. And come January of 2021, it came out, and here we are.
That's crazy, like, how far it's come and, like, 6 issues in, like, since January 2021, that's insane.
Thanks. You know, it's funny. I wish we could have moved faster, but I mean, in comics, like there are always so many gears turning. We're not all like as multi-talented as you, where like you can do the writing, the art, the coloring, and what you're lettering your own book too, right?
Yeah.
That's
I don't know if I
insane.
can do all of them. The
Um,
quality of some parts of those is a little questionable, but
but you're doing it, which is super rad. Like nobody can say that they're doing all of that on that level so early in their career. So kudos to you.
oh, thanks.
Um, but because I'm not that talented, I have to work with a lot of other really talented people, and sometimes, things come up and the gears kind of begin to clunk up, and
Mhm.
so things came out a little bit slower than I would have wanted to, but it was a lot. There was a lot to learn, like I would not trade that for anything, because if those things didn't happen, I wouldn't have found my current collaborator, Sam, who is an absolute gem, like a pleasure to work with, talented beyond my wildest dreams. Um, and it's taught me how to manage a team better, particularly as an editor. Most people don't realize that when you're editing in comics, you're also kind of project managing, and there's a lot that you don't think about going into it that I've had to learn in some ways, like some ways that kind of had to take the road less traveled, but um it was I don't like I said, don't take it back because I think it kind of built character. But I wish sometimes I think to myself like, man, I could probably have been a couple projects deep by now, but it is what it is. It's made me the creative that I am now, and I feel pretty good about that.
Oh, yeah, and I mean, like, even the pace it's at now, like, it seems crazy. I know, like, we're always our own worst critics, but, like, from an
Mm.
outsider's perspective, like, no, that's, like, crazy impressive.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
It's been a really cool time, like and I'm sure you've seen this, like it just being able to look back sometimes and look at like where you've come versus where you started. I mean, like my sales pitch at conventions, anytime people are like, I really liked your first book, I'm like, that's great because that's the worst thing I've ever written. Like You know what I mean? And that's like the first book in this series, but it's true. Like knowing that like every step along the way, you're finding your flaws or you're picking up new tools to then use, and you're like stretching what you think yourself capable of. It's kind of incredible. Um, and I'm sure you probably felt the same way. You look at like maybe something that you did a year ago and you're like, you're pointing out like a couple of things here and there that you would change, or maybe it's an entire difference, but like that's part of the fun of the creative process, is watching yourself become like an entirely different animal.
Yeah, I find it's like the best motivator too. I find sometimes, especially with social media, it's easy to like compare yourself to other writers or other artists or whatnot, and then you start getting in your head and being really critical of yourself. But if you compare yourself going back to yourself like 2 years ago, then you're
Hmm.
like, oh wow, this is actually okay. It's pumping me up. I want to draw more now.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, I don't draw as much, but yes, I can relate.
Yeah.
um Now, and I think the cool thing is like it's always really useful no matter what role you're in comics, because it's so osmotic to like know a little bit about everything. So like whatever direction you end up taking, whether it's like becoming a writer artist or focusing on one particular area or the other, now you understand how the rest of the machine works, and you can shape a little bit of what you do around that, because I imagine there are going to be more projects in the future where you're doing everything, but you'll probably have more projects where like you might just be writing or might just be drawing, or like for me, I always prided myself on like kind of understanding the pain of everybody in the process. So I try not to be like the overbearing writer, but also knowing that sometimes people just want like more concrete direction. And so it's my responsibility to be as succinct as I possibly can, particularly as somebody who likes to babble all the time.
I guess, yeah, that's nice that you can kind of empathize and have that understanding for all the parts of the process. And then it's a nice collaborative team process with, positive interactions for everyone involved.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, like comics, it's like a blessing and a curse, right? Because from the time you outline or script a project, you're taking an idea and you're filtering it through so many different people's eyes, and I think that it, it's just it's interesting, right? It's like this very
Mhm.
like Taoist principle because it could go horribly wrong, or you could just create something that's greater than the sum of its parts, right? Like, and that's I think kind of the cool thing about making comics is that ultimately, because you're working with so many different people that have different perspectives and different approaches creatively, you can create something that isn't not different, but like something that is ultimately larger or better or greater than what you could have done on your own.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, it's nice getting the input from everyone. Even for mine, I'll get a lot of input from my fiance and my brother. Will have like weekly meetings just to go over the story and the overall plot and everything. Because, yeah, it's so nice to get that outside feedback, sometimes noticing things that you never would have picked up on,
Hmm.
or totally thinking outside the box. Or my fiance is really good at taking like I'll have these ideas for stuff that needs to happen, but they're just like chaos and don't make any sense and don't fit together. And he'll come in and be like, "Hey, well, no, it should be structured like this, and here's the
Mm.
timeline and everything." So
And
yeah,
I think there's also something to be said too about what you're doing and kind of having your hand in every element of the creative process because like then what you're doing now is purely yours. And I think that is also a separate strength, because like at the end of the day when it's done, it's one, it's on your merit, but also like you're saying what you wanted to say the whole time, and there's nothing at the end of the day that's going to make you feel like you were shorted. And I think like you get that a lot in comics where creators, because there are so many hands in the cookie jar, creators might not feel like they were able to create something that feels like it's identifiably theirs. And that's a unique opportunity that you have with Rich and whatever you choose to do in the future. It's like it's 100% you distilled into a comic, which is awesome.
yeah, it seems bizarre. I'm just I love it so much. It's like my passion project. So I'm just like every second working on it, it's just like my happy place. So it's
Mm,
fun to work on it, but I
yeah.
think Milton sent in the chat a cool point. He said, "Never discard ideas, save them for a later time,"
Hmm.
which is yeah, I don't know if you found the same thing, if you ever get into those situations where you'll have, like, plot points laid out and then just those hours that you'll have to sometimes spend, like, rearranging stuff and like, "Hey, no, this is actually for, like, 5 issues later," like, "This needs to be moved up," or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah. And sometimes like for me, I'll be writing one thing and get ideas for something entirely separate. And like that's how I came, like my next project is an anthology with a bunch of short stories, and a lot of those ideas I came up with while writing the Helix Project, and none of them are anything like the Helix Project. But like there's something about the confluence of like sitting down and like filtering yourself out creatively where sometimes something just comes that's totally unrelated. And there's also like a separate skill of not like being like a small bird and like gravitating too far to the next shiny thing, right?
Yeah.
But it's also really cool because I think it's just like, you're taking like a very small piece of what you're working on in the moment, and somehow you've extrapolated that into like, I don't know, like a sci-fi future where like the government decides that old people are liabilities and therefore are eradicating old people, which has nothing to do with what you're doing now, but like that's kind of cool, like the creative process is so liquid in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, each thing kinda gives you seeds for other things and just
Hmm.
starts sprouting off, which is yeah, it just kind of feel gets you even more amped up to start working on stuff.
For sure. I'm really curious because we're the same age, right? You're 25, right?
Mhm, yeah.
So you like I've noticed like you've done work with like Todd McFarlane, right? Like and you tend to fall into like a lot of that cool, like energetic sort of 90s comic aesthetic. Where does that come from? Because like we were born kind of after that 90s wave. So I'm
Yeah.
curious like what were your like original influences in getting you into comics, and how did that lead into like what you're into now?
I guess it was like a lot of both my parents are always my whole family were all nerds, so both my parents like raised us on comics, but it was always kind of like the comics that they grew up with or that they were like had been into recently. So yeah, my parents both kind of introduced me really young to like the 90s comics. Like I remember
Mm,
reading the really old Firestar comics and like Todd McFarlane's run on Spider-Man was
mm,
like one of my favorites as a kid. So yeah, I feel like those were and even just watching like the old 60s Spider-Man TV show and stuff.
mm,
Those were all like kind of what I grew up with. So I think yeah, the 90s like definitely really influenced me. And then now I feel like I'm tending to veer a little more towards like anime and manga influences and try
mm.
to incorporate that more, but that's definitely like a bit of a learning curve. Uh
Yeah.
trying to practice that.
Yeah. So, like, on that, what do you feel like? Because I think very clearly, like, Rich has a lot of like influences from both of those camps, right? Like that like energetic 90s comic kind of energy, but also like having that Eastern influence. Like, what about that Eastern storytelling in manga and anime do you feel like you're filtering through Rich?
I feel like I think the biggest thing I like about it is how expressive it is and just
Mm,
how like action scenes are just so dynamic and powerful and
mm,
expressions and it seems like everything is just like dialed up to 100. Like I love
mm,
so I'm trying to incorporate a lot of the like, really extreme like foreshortening or like really extreme expressions with
mhm,
the like speed lines and stuff like that. And then I'm trying to incorporate more screen tones and stuff as well.
mm,
Um, which is I might release like a black and white version of a volume or something later down the line because I still love like the look of just black, white, and gray kind of thing.
mm. Yeah, that contrast is really cool, like, getting to see the bones of the art in that way.
Yeah. What
That's
what
cool.
what were your biggest influences going into, like, even writing wise, like, did
I don't know, it's weird because I got into comics, like, really late compared to most people. Like, when most guys get old enough where they find girls, they're like, "I'm done with comics, they're embarrassing." And I was the opposite. I didn't read comics as a kid. I was, like, 16 or 17, and I had gotten my hands somehow, and it was years after it had come out, on, like, Grant Morrison's Final Crisis, and I was like, "Why is Batman dead? How is Superman singing saving the day, and why is Wonder Woman being